Good afternoon. I'm Sylvia Carmen Cubina, Executive Director of the BAS, and I'd like to give you a warm welcome to Curator Culture. It's the 9th and final series of the talks today. However, don't worry, we'll come back in the fall. So today, Miami-Dade hit 15,000 COVID cases, and it underscores the importance of having these digital programs, how relevant and how necessary they are. I would like to thank profusely, the Knight Foundation for supporting Curator Culture and for recognizing a very long time ago, way before the BAS realized it, that it is important to connect people digitally. These digital programs are very important now more than ever, in the past and in the future. And thank you, Knight Foundation, for pushing us past our comfort zone. I would like to thank the 18 speakers and 2 speakers today for delighting us, for inspiring us, for uplifting us, and for making us think. Above all, I'd like to thank them for connecting us. So finally, today, I would like to thank and introduce the ultimate connector, our very own moderator, Tom Healy.
Thank you, Sylvia. Thanks so much. And thank you to everybody. Good afternoon. Thanks so much for joining us. To those of you who haven't been part of those other Curator Culture conversations, the idea behind the talks has been to bring fascinating people from very different walks of life together for conversation and see where that mashup takes us. And over the last few months, we've really deliberately focused our conversations on how the world is changing. We've had some profound issues with the pandemic and with the changes that have happened in the protests after George Floyd's death and the changes to dramatic changes that we're all experiencing. The questions often we dwell on here: how does art be part of this? What happens with that? Today we have 2 extraordinary people, a good friend of mine, Anna Deavere Smith, the actor, director, playwright, teacher, extraordinary individual, and Eric Schmidt, whom I just got to meet this winter. What I'll just say about both of them, given who Eric Schmidt is in the history, Google it and you'll find out who these extraordinary people are. Why did I want to put Eric and Anna together today? Well, there's a wonderful book that Anna wrote called Letter to a Young Artist. And in it, she talks about the idea that being an artist is kind of like being a mathematician, that you see a problem and you see it as a kind of opportunity for a solution. And I met Eric, and in the quick conversation, I saw that he saw the world that way. Lots of problems and a mind that was extraordinarily going toward solutions. And Anna, you wrote that your friend Toni Morrison used to say she was ready to write when she had something to fret about, to go with this idea of problems to be solved. And so I thought I'd pose that as the first question to both of you to get this started. What are you fretting about?
Everything. At first I was fretting about the not known. And actually for me, as an artist, having absolutely nothing to say about the pandemic because words are not sufficient. Words cannot express. I do not have the words. I'm an artist of words and performance and all the obvious things that go along with all of our performances being delayed and we don't know. But I think the biggest thing being the not knowing. And I'm a person who doesn't mind not knowing. I start every semester with when I teach saying confidence is overrated, give doubt a try. And I really believe in the creativity that comes from doubt. Having said that, how many of us, sorry, that was actually Adrienne Arsh, Miami person. Maybe she's calling to say she's watching. I don't know. But, and then here comes the murder of George Floyd and the unrest that is about us. So I'm in a state of fret. I don't know that I'm fretting about anything. I think I'm in a state of fret, but I do think, and I've had a chance to look at some things, Eric, about Schmidt Futures and the work that you're doing with New York State. I also agree that these are opportunities as well as enormous challenges.
You know, Tom, I'm just really upset that our government is failing us and that we Americans are better than this. When faced with a real challenge, as I understand our history, we have risen to the challenge. Well, we've not risen to this one. And indeed, the simple metric of the number of infections per day is galloping forward with unknown but undoubtedly bad consequences for the victims, whether their infections are mild or whether they ultimately die. And so to think that things are okay is to be in an alternate universe. We don't know what the peak is. We don't know if we're at the beginning or near the end of the ascent. We don't know if it's accelerating. And I just don't understand why collectively we're not discussing it in the terms of the national emergency that we're in. If we fail, which we are at the moment, in addition to the many lives that we lost, the bankruptcies, the economic costs, the impact on children, the impact on the culture and the lifestyle and the arts and so forth and so on, is unknowable. And just to go on, you have New York-sized pandemics in greater Miami, greater Houston, a few other cities. Where is the outrage? These are real people being really harmed by this terrible, terrible virus. That's what I'm upset about.
Mm-hmm. Anna, what is your sense of what is this disconnect? Your work has always, as you said, just by listening to people, tripped itself into politics often. And so there's kind of no avoiding politics in this.
Well, I don't think it's just politics. I think, number one, we're in also a sort of a moral crisis, a crisis of a moral imagination, which has been building and building as long ago as the 60s. I'm thinking about how, for my play about the school to prison pipeline, one of the places I went was to South Carolina. And where one of the first case, Briggs versus Elliott, which became a part of Brown versus Board of Ed, was born. And in talking to one of the people who had signed that original petition, I mean, it's something we all know, but I learned that immediately after Brown versus Board of Ed, white Southerners created Christian schools so that they would not have to obey any of the laws about integration. And so we know that the gaps between those who have and those who do not are wide. Also, the gaps between those who know and get a chance to know and those who don't is wide. So what does that mean? It means also that we lack empathy. Now, that's a really soft word, so I'm not going to expand too much about it. But if you are already inside of a sort of behind your picket fence, what I call your safe house of identity, wherever you are, whether that's your advantage, whether that's your political outlook, whether that's your gender, your sexuality, whatever it is, if you're there and you don't have this other kind of inner fortitude that allows you to move outwards and touch somebody else, if not really with your heart and your mind, then everything on that platform is going to be a disconnect, in addition to a crisis in leadership.
Anna is so right here. I approach, she says it better than I do, but I say it in the following way. In the spirit of we're better than this, remember that half of the transmission of this disease is thought to be either pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic, which translates to you don't know you're giving it to somebody else. And I've yet to find anybody who wants to give it to someone else. The best thing that you can do to avoid giving it to someone else is to wear a mask. Why we can't get this through ourselves that it's not about me and my rights to not have to wear a mask, but rather my right to not infect someone else 50% of the time. It's a harshness in our society that's, and I don't understand normally these things are expressed because of economic interests. So, the big corporation wants something, and so it's marketing something which is not in your interest, or, whatever the stereotype is. You can speak, Tom, better about that than I. But this notion of somehow complete absolute freedom, well, when I was young, you were certainly okay to drive drunk. At least that was the view. But then courageous people pointed out that it was okay for you to drive drunk and kill yourself, but it was not okay for you to kill everyone else. Right? So why we have to go through this again, having gone through drunk driving and other things like that, over something which is so obviously not in anyone's interest to do, which is to infect other people. Where did we get so unmoral and uncaring as a society?
Also, though, it's just and Eric, you know a lot about systems, so maybe this is something you can solve. I happen to have gone to get tested today on a Sunday. I was able to go get a test. I've already been tested before. I'm getting tested again today. I was negative before. Hopefully I still am. And it was a drive-through, actually at Stanford. And my friend who drove with me there, they were passing me through to get the test. And she said, well, can I get one too? And they said, no. And she said, well, how do I get one? Well, you have to have a prescription from your doctor, blah, blah, blah. These tests, this should not be a problem thinking about where can I get a test? Are they free? Are they not free? So, I mean, that too is like, how are we going to make the tests available?
But just to amplify that, I took the Stanford test, the one that you just had as well, when it was first established, and the accuracy is very good, and I'm sure you're negative. I was negative as well. In Florida, test positivity is something around 17%. In Arizona, it's been as high as 26%. So what that means is that one out of every 4 people who gets tested is positive. The WHO guidelines is that you're more or less under control if your test positivity is below 5%. New York is 1%. The Northeast is in the 1% to 2% range, having had it really badly. So why is this test positivity thing so important? If most of the tests or a good chunk of the tests that you're doing are positive, you don't know the extent of the untested population. So an example would be that if there were 63,000 infections on Friday, what's the real number? People think it's about 5 times larger, 300,000 for purposes of discussion. Again, mostly across the South, concentrated in Florida, Texas, Arizona, places, by the way, where it's largely, in my view, being spread by air conditioning. So, which we can debate. But the important point is, because we don't have testing, and we're not going to get enough testing in the next N months, we're going to have to approximate that we don't know and wear masks. And because the test positivity rates are so high, there's reasons to believe that the epidemic is much worse in these places than we're hearing. So again, where is the outrage? Where is the government response? And it's things like Anna said, but there's plenty of others. I'll give you another example. Pick New York. For a long time, you could get on the subway or a bus without a mask. Now you can't. Well, wasn't it obvious that they should have done that in week 1? What about airplanes? Don't you think that they should require masks in all the airplanes? Right? It's like, they're not expensive. The airplane ticket costs a great deal more than the mask. The mask is a few cents. Really? We're better than this.
Anna, I want to get back to, your first place to go was to talk about those early cases, even pre-Brown versus Ferguson. How do you think we're in an issue with a new problem, or is this question of a lack of empathy, a divide between us? Are we looking at something that's fundamental, and maybe we're not approaching it the right way because we're looking at it as a surprise of something new?
Are you talking about COVID? Are you talking about COVID and the reckoning? You mean all of it or what?
All of it.
Yeah. Well, let's go back to something Eric has been saying. Where's the outrage? You know, this is actually an incredible opportunity, right? And there must be extraordinary marketing campaigns that could be done to intoxicate us, get us to understand that we are all one. Now, you know, part of it goes back to this thing of freedom. I went to Rwanda 10 years after the genocide, and I had a chance to meet the president and so forth. And I was there exactly when they were doing these gacaca trials, which are their form of truth and reconciliation. So I met Tutsis and I went to these trials, and the Hutus would come forward and have to say what they had done. And if a very small, tiny community, like almost like under a tree, very small, I thought I'd be going to a courtroom. And they would speak about what they had done to people in that community. And then if they were believed, they were free. If they weren't, they went back to prison. But part of that whole thing was about how to get people out of prison. In other words, whatever they had done, to find a way to get the country to move on. And so for the Tutsis, there was something that was spiritual, really, and I think their Christianity helped them with this, and I'm not necessarily a religious person, to the forgiveness campaign. Now, it's not that I'm talking specifically about the good of forgiveness or not. What I'm talking about is the potential of a country to come together under whatever ethic, whatever umbrella, and to agree that they all have to do something, whether they like it or not, whether they're comfortable or not, that's for the benefit of the country. Now, my friend Samantha Power would say the same thing that allowed them to do that is the same thing that allowed the genocide. Mm-hmm. But where is that place? What is that part of our cultural imagination that will cause us to be concerned about our brother and our sister?
Can I
don't know the answer.
Okay.
I mean, quickly say art can usually help, right? Because there's a lot about art that's influential, in terms of emotions in the spirit. I think of art as a kind of a secular religion. So it can help, but artists are on lockdown too.
So, Anna, you and I have spoken about this a little bit before, and I wanted to give you a way of thinking about why this is happening. And the simple answer is that the incentives are driving us apart rather than together. And so the simplest way to understand it is that in a political system which is awash with money, the best way to get money and attention, which correlates to money, is to be outrageous. And so the complicated force of mediation, which you saw in Rwanda, which is painful and slow and is this very difficult process, doesn't lead itself to political gamesmanship, fundraising, outrage, lots of attention online. And my guess is that the incentive systems that we play with, right? I'll use the internet broadly speaking now, I'm talking about social media and other things, are inconsistent with the world you're describing that we would like. Every study indicates that if you take all that information away and you talk to people, they're much more similar than they sound. So there's some kind of disconnect between the essential human goodness of citizens, in particular of Americans, and then what we're seeing today. I don't know how you think we can bridge that, but I worry a lot about that too.
But I would assume, Eric, that in that bridge, it's not as if technology is going away. It's not as if these ways of manufacturing outrage and other things, you're not saying to do these by disconnecting, right? It's still somehow got to embrace the technology and the social connection that we have to do that.
Well, one argument is that a percentage of people will become more like the Amish, in the sense that they'll say, I just can't take this anymore.
Right.
So let's assume that that's 0.5% or something. So 99% of the people are going to be stuck in this information space, which has these weird incentives that we're all reacting to. And my own view in the short term is that they'll get worse. And the reason is it's easy to shape the information discourse with misinformation. In my world, quite a few people believe that the discord that we feel has been aided by foreign powers. In other words, those that want to manipulate it are spending a little time boosting the voices of dissent against the system as a whole. Right now, I'm not saying I know that. I'm just telling you people think that. It's probably true. There's some evidence to it. I don't know the extent. So in a situation where the most outrageous voice, the nihilistic voice, the tear everything down voice, which is a destructive voice, is amplified by additional resources, or is naturally amplified by virtue of the tendency of the media to look at unique cases that are not representative, right? In other words, the extreme case is not the average case. Those may be driving this. And because all of us are, roughly speaking, sitting at home in an information space that surrounds us, this gets worse, not better for a while. Because we don't agree collectively on what appropriate speech is, and I'm not suggesting that there is one, I think that the system will continue to pulse and drive. By the way, the Black Lives activities, which I generally support, obviously, are going to be used by its opponents in very poor ways as well. In other words, for every action, there's an opponent that will then misuse that information for other reasons. And we've seen that already.
So if this continues, Eric, and I agree with you, I think it does. What's a tipping point?
Well, there's not necessarily a tipping point in a democracy, but there's certainly a loss of faith in the system. So I'll just speak for myself because I can authoritatively say what I think. And I'm disappointed with our political system. All those speeches about how wonderful we are, well, if we were that wonderful, we wouldn't be sitting in a crisis where 140,000 people have died and there are forecasts of 500,000 deaths. This is not okay. You know, I'm going to be the first one to say, I'm mad about it. It's not okay. I want to hear some outrage from our citizens to tell our government to figure it out. Everyone has their proposal. There's various examples of how to do this, starting with wearing masks, right? Restrictions on indoor spaces, closing the bars, closing indoor restaurants. It's a fairly straightforward list. By the way, the prisons are hothouses for the disease. We're very slow to release prisoners. Let's get a few more out. Anna has worked hard on this for obvious and good reasons. We kept the meatpacking plants open, even though they were a known area of spreading. Perhaps we could do with a little bit less meat for a few weeks while we fix them, right? If the objective was, rather than complaining in our corners, and by the way, everything gets mitigated by Trump and anti-Trump. If we just instead say, what do we have to do to systematically reduce the infection rate of the disease every day? Every day the numbers have to go down. We'll do whatever it takes to make them go down. Then we will get through this and we'll get through this and we can go back to having our normal arguments, which are far less important than the number of people who are going to die during this pandemic.
Where's the leadership? Let's put Washington aside, right? I've benefited in my lifetime from leadership that's not, that is not in the center, sort of not the official leadership. Where's the leadership going to come from? I mean, Eric, you're doing this incredible RISE project and you're interested in individuals. You have faith in individuals. Where are the leaders? How do we find them? How do we cultivate them? What's some of the stuff you're doing to do that? Right.
So I personally am very, very interested in developing the next generation of leaders. Because of my industry, which is largely run by young people, I have a strong belief that the sooner we let younger people run things, the better off people my age will be. But my view is not the majority view I should have had. And for all sorts of reasons, we need to hear their voices, we need to get them developed, and we need to put them in charge sooner. And there's lots and lots of talent. So again, a hopeful message is that in the universities of America, which are at the moment not on and only meeting a little bit next year, we have extraordinary talent coming out. Let's listen to them, right? This is their world. This is the world that they're going to be dominant in when we're basically retired. So anyway, but I think, again, I want to stay focused on the immediacy of this. Everyone wants to change the subject because they're tired of COVID. Well, I'm tired of COVID too. And the way I'd like to change the subject is to get the infection rate down. And that's a global problem. I'm also very concerned about India, Iran, a number of other countries where Brazil, for obvious reasons. If you look at Brazil and the United States, you've had very similar behavior by the leadership, where you had the essentially denial and then not very much mitigation. The countries that have aggressively addressed this, starting with New Zealand and working on from there, are in much, much better shape. By the way, China, we spent a lot of time complaining about, is doing quite well right now because they've managed to get their factories humming, their economics are working, their people are largely back at work. Why? Because they went through draconian reaction to a pandemic that was so severe there. And I'm not suggesting we do their draconian reaction, but I'm suggesting that if you're, instead of worried about one group, let's just worry about US values versus Chinese values. The best way for US values to win is for the US to win. And we're not winning in this area.
In all the planning that is done for this kind of outbreak and epidemic, has this issue ever been addressed, the difficulty of conveying the seriousness? Right.
No,
what happened with that? That almost feels like we needed artists in the room.
What is interesting to me is that all of the history did not understand that with a pandemic, you have to deal with both the health problem and the economic problem at the same time. And so what has happened is we dealt with the health problem for a little bit, and then we got bored with dealing with that because it was so painful. And instead we started focusing on reopening, and now we have a double whammy. And I'm not aware of people really thinking it through. And I think that may just be the stovepipe nature of scientists and so forth. I'm not aware of people who've unified it. There is obviously a communications problem. It may very well be that our artists are the most trusted people in America today. Perhaps they can be our communicators.
Charles Rosenberg at Harvard wrote a paper about AIDS, about the dramaturgy of a pandemic. And the first act is the act where people don't believe it. And it seems like we're still in the first act, because part of the problem is, as you are saying, people don't understand the gravity of the problem. They don't believe it. They know it, but they don't believe it.
Could you repeat his name so everybody can hear it?
Charles Rosenberg, Harvard University. He happens to be married to Drew Faust, the former president of Harvard.
Mm-hmm. Good. Well, let's stick with that drama metaphor, since this is your world, Anna. You've actually defined drama as that state of being unprepared, right? So we're enacting some kind of drama right now.
Yeah, and dramas are a state of unprepared for it to be tragedies or to be comedies. You're not prepared for that pie to hit you in the face.
Right.
But I'm all too aware that this is not a drama. That this is very real. And I think any great drama, by the way, Tom, about it will be after.
Sure.
After it is seemingly settled. So it's very hard, I think, for anybody to really grasp what this is. We don't completely know what it is. Just think in these last few months how much has changed about what you could do, what you can't do. For the longest time, we thought it was on hard surfaces, Mm-hmm. So I think we also so let me play devil's advocate and suggest that maybe we don't yet know enough about it. That could be a knowledge gap.
Well, it's interesting because just to stick with that, the drama thing again, I'll go at it from the poetry side, but Auden used to say that drama is about there being a mistake. And there are two parts of it. Is the mistake happens. You thought your friend turns out to be your enemy, or the woman you're in love with turns out to be your mother. And these issues of drama, so that there is this mistake. But the big part, as you're saying, secondly, is coming to realize you've made the mistake.
Yeah, the realization. And by the way, the realization is either a relief or incredibly painful, unbearable. And maybe this is what, Eric, you were talking about in terms of we can't stay with it very long.
What's interesting, Anna, is I'm reading from the citation that you quoted. Let me just read a bit of it. Most communities are slow to accept and acknowledge an epidemic. To some extent, it's a failure of imagination. Perhaps even more, it is a threat to interest, to specific economic and institutional interests, and more generally to the emotional assurance and complacency of ordinary men and women. Right, this is exactly right.
Mm-hmm. So, but in some sense, what he's saying is that that's natural. The shaking us out of it is the harder part. And those, I guess, that's the deaths, that's the pain, that's the economic devastation that's happening. And perhaps it's still in slow motion to too many people, Eric.
Well, a very more troubling idea is, in whose interest is it? In whose interest is it for it to continue?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not suggesting that it's in anyone else's interest that people die. What I am suggesting is that there is an apparent trade-off between health and economic growth, and we appear to have ignored the genuine health costs in a race to come to economic growth. You have to solve both problems. The way I would solve this problem is pretty straightforward. I think and I'll say it in as blunt a way as I can. If you look at the severe consequences of this disease, it's people above 65. There are exceptions, but the norm is above 65. So people above 65 should basically stay home, right, and limit what they're doing. But people who are of working age, roughly speaking, should engage in commerce, but with restrictions. Wearing masks in the office, wearing masks in transport, figuring out ways to get kids in school without too much propagation of the disease. That's probably the best that we can do given where we are. And we're not willing to do mandatory contact tracing and mandatory, basically, isolation of people. And it's probably the case that we can get to the point, using what I'm proposing, or a point where there will be periodic outbreaks, which the public health people can actually go at. The problem is that as long as the infection rate is accelerating at this rate, we have no idea the extent to which where the outbreaks are. We don't have any way to trace them. We have no way to test them. So the lack of a testing apparatus, which again is a major government failing, the FDA was very slow in allowing them. Now there are testing programs, but again, it's very confused. They don't get enough money. Right? We spent a couple $1 trillion bailing out various businesses and small businesses and so forth, and PPP, which is very important. But we did not put a large chunk of money in that period into the sentinel systems that would give us the information to help us manage the disease, right? So again, there's something wrong in the decision-making here. I'm trying to play to the point where the disease will be, and I'm ignoring the vaccine question, where the disease will be present, but not a fear every day, right? That's probably the best short-term outcome we can get to. What are the steps we need to do to get to that? Masks are the most obvious one.
I'd like to have you both talk about what this means for education. You're both educators. Anna, you've been looking hard at the school system. Eric, this is part of your purview in helping New York address this, but also you've both been teachers. Where do you see this happening for this fall and for the year ahead?
The fall is going to be a disaster, I think, on every front. I mean, even at the level of universities that are like universities, right? I mean, what's going to happen? I mean, when it's a mess, when students drop out, say, I'm just not going to do this. We're all trying to be as imaginative as possible. I'm going to teach a class on Zoom, one-person shows. At least they don't have to be together to do it. But of course, what I have been looking at since 2012, as you know, Tom, is what's called the school to prison pipeline. And I actually came out of all that thinking it's not even fair to call it the school to prison pipeline, because the line to poverty, and obviously we've had a movement against prisons for some time, and my interest is young people, the boys originally, and now, as I mentioned, looking at the whole ecosystem by seeing how, in particular, it affects girls as one other stop on the map. The schools are a disaster for poor kids. And so, I mean, the only good thing that could come of this is an entire reorganization, the same way that a lot of people hope that the pandemic will lead us to a better healthcare system. But I think there needs to be, out of this, in this disarray, a revolution in terms of what we're going to do with the public schools.
The pandemic is accelerating some changes that were underway. Part of the commission that I lead in New York is to try to get to as close to 100% broadband participation for New York State residents, as well as increasing the use of telehealth from a minuscule amount to very high percentages, as well as rethinking skilling and training to get the workforce more ready for a more digital world. All of these things are very, very important. At the college level, colleges will get through this with all sorts of accommodations. Some people will go to schools, they'll go half school, things like this, and they're all struggling with it. But I'm confident they'll get through it. I'm extremely worried about K through 12. And the reason is that if we can't come up with an effective way of having children in school, K through 12, their parents can't both work. And the burden on especially mothers, but couples, but in particular mothers, is profound. And I think it's crucial that we work collectively to find a way to safely have the kids in school. Now, the reports on transmission for children are roughly that children below the age of 10 or so don't seem to get it very much. The disease is, again, correlated with age. There are always exceptions, but it's correlated with age. But there's some evidence that kids can transmit it to their parents and grandparents. And there's certainly evidence that teenagers are like adults in the sense of transmissibility and getting the disease and so forth. So we have not yet, at least I have not seen good solutions in public schools where the schools were already overloaded, they were already overworked, and now they need more space, more money, more teachers, and what have you. And I think this is the number one tactical issue, besides getting the infection rate down, which we've got to do like today, is we've got to figure out a way to get the public schools open, or the cycle that Anna talks about just gets worse. The schools are really part of the American dream. And if we can't solve this problem, it hurts the parents, it hurts the kids, it hurts all of us.
Well, when I was working on Notes from the Field, the Chief Justice of the State of California said it, the Supreme Court of the State of California said it so simply and so truly: when you're not in school, you're in trouble. Period, the end. When you're not in school, you're in trouble. I'm going to tell you a little story, see what y'all think of this. In 1993, I think, something like 93, I got this call, and at the time I was living in San Francisco, that George Lucas would like to see me. So you can imagine, go out there. And it was like a New Yorker cartoon in a way, at least in my mind, Sure, I feel like it was a room that was a block long. I'm sure it wasn't, but that's it. Emotion was to me. And there's George Lucas there, and I'm way over there. And he very calmly laid out a plan for schools. This is 92, 93. And his plan was that there shouldn't be school, that kids should learn at home on a computer, and then they should have mentors. The problem being that some kids don't like their teachers. A lot of kids don't like their teachers. And so at the end of this, I said, well, what about if like the electricity's not working in your house? Or what about if, there's no place for you to do this? Your house is in disarray. Well, this is what's been happening for some children right now. And he said, well, I haven't thought through the social part of it. So what I'm telling you here is that on the one hand, George Lucas had a premonition of where we're going to be, but the computers aren't available or working for everybody. And we have no clue what to do with the problem of how we convene, what happens when we don't convene, what about that teacher in poor schools right now? How is that teacher going to be dealing in a class with this new paradigm? So to me, it comes back to something that was at the beginning of the conversation, Eric, when you were suggesting, why don't we give a damn? And so, if the goodness that could come out of this is an increased giving a damn about people who don't have all of the protections that upper middle class people have, all of the things that are in the way. I met a woman who told me, wealthy woman, who told me that her son was having trouble in school, also in San Francisco. The head of school came to their house every single day. The head of school came to their house every single day. I was an artist in residence at Grace Cathedral in 2012. I would be approaching the cathedral. Now, the distance between the curb to the opening of the door of the school is not very long. But a teacher would come out and greet each child getting out of those fancy cars and walk them into school. And yet, when I brought the Girls Choir of Harlem to the Institute of Arts and Civic Dialogue, which I held at Harvard for 3 summers, they talked about just all the things that happened to them on the way to school, all the things that could get in the way of them trying to become the singers that they wanted to be. So these obstacles that are alive and well, not just in the schools, but in the entire community around the school.
Mm-hmm.
America is a land of opportunity, and we have our founding myth and our view of American exceptionalism, which is around America is a place where anyone can become president. Well, I think we've proven that, and where economic opportunity is available to all. And yet, for the reasons that Anna has articulated, this is becoming, it may never have been true, but it's certainly getting less likely now. There's evidence of less dynamism within America, that is literally less people moving from state to state, more associative mating in the sense of people marrying people of similar things. There's less intermixing, if you will, of the various different groups of people. And so I worry that the congealing of the country is accelerated by a pandemic and the other crises, because people are acting out of natural self-protection rather than acting in the common good. So from my perspective, the most common good thing that you can do is try to keep everyone healthy and keep everyone busy, right? If you can't solve the health problem, then you can't solve the education problem. If you can't solve the education problem, you can't solve the opportunity problem, because without an opportunity, nobody gets anywhere anymore. If you look at the last 20 years, the economic returns to education have been very, very clear. College education and beyond has been the only way in which you had a better salary than your parents. And people who did not follow in that have every reason to think that in the next 10 years, their economic situation will get worse. Economics is not the only measure of happiness, but in a consumer society like ours, where there are such differences in wealth and ability that Anna is articulating, we have to do everything we can to give people that opportunity without sending them to school, by having people work from week to week in the way that they are, the kind of personal bankruptcies that people are going on. Remember, an awful lot of the people that we're talking about work in the industries that serve us.
Right.
People who, they're in the service industries, which is much of America, and they serve us. They help us with food. They help us with transportation. They help us get around, right? And they don't necessarily love going to work in the middle of a pandemic. So you can imagine that we're to some degree, the inequalities in our society are coming back to bite us, because we are the same human beings in both our hopes and our vulnerabilities, both emotional and medical. The virus does not discriminate.
Right. I mean,
Let me
I'm sure.
just interrupt for a quick sec to encourage people to ask questions. We're getting to that moment, and then we have a few questions
I
coming.
mean, last week was the first time I had a chance to talk to people outside the United States about the pandemic. And I wish I had sought that out earlier because, and I talked to 3 women in Latin America. And because that's really when I hate to say, that's when I got it. This is the world. And that may be part of the why don't people give a damn thing, Eric, or why we're still in Act 1 that we don't believe it. You know what I mean? Like I'm aware of it happening elsewhere. I'm having quarantinis with friends in England or whatever. But actually talking to 3 humanitarian aid people in Latin America, I thought, this is really worldwide. And one of the things they talked about was like sort of informal economies. And I would suppose those are going to increase in the United States if people lose their jobs. And then what are those informal economies require people to be in the streets and mobile in a kind of a way that they will be very vulnerable to the disease.
Right. So here's a question for both of you. As former educators, what do you see as the long-term effects for younger children, less college preparedness, but generalized lower performance expectations, whole issues for younger kids? What advice would you give parents who are trying to make it happen?
Well, I just want to quickly say something about despair and hopelessness. And one of the great things about school, whether you are, or bad things about school, whether you're doing well in the official system of school or not, is the social convening. And you know, we know there's bullying and all these things that aren't good. But students have a culture of their own that's not just about what is set up by authorities. Sure. And if kids can't experience that in a safe way, that can't be a good thing. That has to lead to kind of psychological effects that I'm not aware of much discussion. I'm sure when I go back to teach at NYU, I'll at least hear about it on the psychological effects of this, at least on a college level. But I do think about where's fun? What's fun mean now? Right? We've already complained that kids spend too much time on screens.
In roughly 1910, there was this sort of realization that the majority of the citizens of our country were in farms. And there was a real problem with basically getting them educated. And there were a series of initiatives in that period around essentially universal high school. And we have benefited enormously as a country. People have gone back and looked at the educational level, which they can measure by writing and so forth and so on. And it appears that the average American was almost illiterate compared to where we are today. Now, obviously, the elite was fine. So this gap between the elite and the average has been with us for 100 years, but we have benefited, again, a great deal by universal education. It's pretty clear to me that if we can figure out a way for high school students, for example, to get the online world plus some kind of in-person world working, some kind of compromise will be okay. My guess is that for younger kids, first, second, third grade, they really do need to be together. And so I think our educators need to have a serious conversation about those trade-offs. In universities, what they're doing is one university is saying the freshmen will be all on campus and none of the sophomores. And that is a direct discrimination in favor of freshmen and against sophomores because they want the sophomores to have at least one of 2 bonding years, right? It's a reasonable response to a pandemic, but I don't see that uniformly through the educational system, that or things that are similar. I just don't see it. It's too polyglot. It's too random. There needs to be more guidance and more suggestions. People don't know quite how to solve this problem yet.
To take up one thing that Anna was bringing up earlier, is what areas systematically, social organization, education, the rest, or do you see as possibly ripe for radical transformation during this time? I mean, I just read this fascinating article about the Camden Police Department And they were actually able to make the kinds of changes, structural changes that a lot of departments want to talk about because the city went broke and they had to totally disband and restart. So there really was a kind of catastrophic organizational event that made change possible.
Well, as a broad statement, and there are always exceptions, incumbents don't self-reform. They say they're going to self-reform, but for many, many, many reasons, the incumbents tend to be relatively conservative against radical change. So radical change occurs in a war, in a bankruptcy, in a huge competitive move, in a great tragedy, that sort of thing. And that's a broad statement.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure we can take more than the pandemic at the moment. I'm not arguing for some rate of change that humans can take. There is evidence in education that we can invert the classroom, that it looks like, and this is work done, I was on the board of this company for many years called the Khan Academy. It looks like students are capable of learning online, where essentially they do the work online and the teachers help them, as opposed to the teachers presenting. So in other words, the students, you gamify the learning experience, and then the teachers supervise that. So that you need the teachers, they don't go away, but they invert what they're doing. They're not lecturing, right? The kids are learning from the computer. And furthermore, there's evidence that this approach works particularly well for underserved groups who might have a deficiency of one kind, they fall behind from social pressure, all of a sudden they feel like they're being discriminated against, and then they start to cut up and they give up and so forth and so on. So it looks to me like we have an opportunity for a national experiment around empowering individual learning with this very important, with supervision by the teachers. You need the teacher changes their behavior.
Well, that's the George Lucas proposal that I heard back in 1993, except he talked about mentors, which to me is a sort of dear, that's sort of the suggestion is that both care about each other, by the way. I'm sure you have mentees and I do too. It's a two-way thing. Where would this happen? Just like in it, the way it does already? I should know about the Khan Academy. I don't really, but would all of these machines really be inside of a building that we've known about as a school previously, or would there be something else?
Well, in the most extreme case, what would happen is, remember, these are learning platforms, so they're just computers, and the kids are on computers anyway. So you might as well just have this amazing lesson plan, and then the teacher zooms in as needed to help the kid. That's not a perfect substitute for being in the same place, but it's an accommodation to a pandemic, which does appear to work broadly for everyone as opposed to just the elites, right? Now, in order to do that, obviously people have to have computers or at least phones. I've been funding some initiatives to try to get courseware onto smartphones, because it seems to me that if you can teach from the smartphone, you can get pretty much everybody one way or the other. Many people don't have a good access to computers, but pretty much everybody in America anyway has access to a at least lower end smartphone with a proper smartphone screen.
The only thing that I think is missing from that plan that I heard, I interviewed 250 people when I wrote Notes from the Field, but I heard over and over again, a caring adult.
Yeah.
A caring adult. What's going to make the difference to keep a kid out of trouble? What's going to make a caring adult? Because we cannot assume that caring adult is at home. Their drug dealers are caring adults. Pimps can be caring adults. The kids find them actually, but who would be the caring adults? And some teachers, I don't know. I don't know how, would that be another person? Would that be other people? Or is that solely the teacher's responsibility?
I agree with everything you said. My comment is, why are we not running these experiments and measuring them? Right? Why don't we say that every school district and every superintendent and so forth has to have one initiative, given it's a pandemic, right? One initiative in this space. Maybe we can collectively figure out that you need a teacher and you need a volunteer Zoomer that you can Zoom to complain to about the teacher and your life. I'm making that up. My point is, we have a platform now, and we could run these experiments, but because we're still wedded to the old model of, hey, we want to be sitting in classrooms, that may not return for years at the current rate of the pandemic. It's a depressing point, right? I want it back as quickly as I can too. But given that this is going to go on not for a month or even 6 months, but maybe a year or two, let's use this opportunity to run the experiments and see what works. What a concept.
Teachers' unions will probably have a revolution, don't you think? I mean, they will rebel, right?
But the teachers' unions are the teachers are more important in my vision for this. They're not less important. Everyone translates technology into job loss.
Well, I see. I get it. Yeah.
You need more teachers.
Right.
Yeah. All right. So you were talking about a longer time span. We have a very short time span here, and we're wrapping this up. But I'd like to look out a little bit.
I think you should have the last word, and this is why. Of all the art forms, I mean, like you're in a rare art form that can be done alone. You're a poet.
Mm-hmm.
I want to know how this is affecting your work.
You know, I think the difficulty, and I've talked with some other writers about this right now, is that in times of social crisis, you often feel that language is in a crisis. I mean, one of the things, I'm going to throw it back to you a little bit, Anna, but one of the things you've said is in these 250 interviews, the time that you're most interested with people is when they're stumbling to find the thing to say. They haven't found it, but the very fact that they're stumbling, if I get you right, is that the urgency is even greater, right? That if you don't have the words, it means you need to find them, that there's something deeply important. And I think we're in that moment. The stumble.
Well, and for me, the words are always, and which is why I go to catastrophic matters and catastrophic events, those very original words that people say when they're trying to make sense of what just happened to them and trying to restore dignity to themselves and their lives, those words come out of a catastrophic event. And so I can only hope, at the risk of being, you know, I like to quote Gloria Steinem that I'm a hopeaholic. So at the risk of being a Pollyanna and not just a hopeaholic, I hope what this is an extraordinary opportunity to make new institutions, to find new people, and to make new words.
Well, let's wrap it with that. We're going to take it with you, Eric. We're going to agree that this is a moment to express an immense amount of outrage, and we're going to do it with a sense of deep hope about what we can accomplish. Anna, Eric, thank you both very, very much. Thanks to the Knight Foundation. Thanks to the audience. Have a good Sunday.
Thank you so much, Tom and Anna. That was great.
Thank you, Eric and Tom.
Thanks. Bye-bye.